Hi, guys. Welcome back to Rendering Unconscious. I'm so excited to have you here to talk about your new book. This is the last in the series, right?
It's the
Wow.
last in the first part of the series.
And how does it feel to have this completely out there? It's been years in the making.
It feels good to have it out there.
It feels a big relief, I think. I mean, I think a couple of times in the course of the project, we had, could we say, disruptions in temporality. And then having realized, I mean, sometimes we've debated this a little bit amongst ourselves. I think the fourth volume came out almost 10 years after we first started thinking about it. And I don't think
Wow.
anyone had expected it would take that amount of time. But in retrospect, you could say, how could it have been any quicker? Just given the nature of the task and the coordination and of course, the other odd temporality distortion was that it's backwards, as you may have noticed. So the the last volume includes the first, how many, 8 or so, probably less, 6 or so Écrits chapters. 8, yeah, first 8 came last. But I mean, I don't know what my colleagues think, but it's a great relief, and I think we're just happy that we managed to get there.
Yeah, I get that Lacan also struggled a lot in writing these papers. He also did like more than 10 years over it. So maybe it's not so strange that we too had to take our time to find people to write the commentaries and to ourselves collect these, comment on these, talk with the authors. It's complex work. It's not something that can be done very quickly, I think.
No, it's a huge undertaking, and the Écrits is notoriously difficult, even for Lacan. So I think this is going to be a real resource for people for, generations to come. And as you know, it's my goal to get all of these authors on at some point or another and talk about all of these chapters. And so far, I've only had Todd McGowan, but COVID happened, and so now that we have finished this book series and we're starting with you, I'm gonna try again.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if Stijn and Calum have found this, but it's also, given the length of time that it took to produce it, it's interesting to go back and read volume 1, and to be reminded of the value of some of those commentaries. I mean, Todd's is certainly one that has been useful in teaching.
I have all of them.
Several. Oh, there you go. You got the whole clip.
I'm a super fan. That's why I have this podcast, so I get to talk to you guys.
It's good to have it because, sometimes when you go back to, one of those seminal contributions in the Écrits, it's nice that you've got your colleagues' scaffolding introduction just to help refresh and remind you and use in I think one of the things, I don't know if we ever verbalized this between us, but for me, one of the things that was so helpful about it was that I know that we've been in reading groups trying to get a sense of it. So it's quite nice to think that the book might be a support for those kinds of activities, which I think it has been so far.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so a number of people have reached out and said they're using it with reading groups, which is really nice. A lot of people are using it with students, which is kind of one of our big aims. So yeah, it seems to be hitting the audience.
Well, I also think that it's a useful support for people who start with a project like the project of reading one of the Écrits. It's good background literature. It's not a replacement for doing the work yourself, but I think it can facilitate things, and I hope that it will also lead to to disagreements actually in the literature, because of course we only have one author, or no, sometimes we have many authors on one chapter, but it's one lens and one specific interpretation. So I can just say for the text that I wrote upon was like the psychosis paper. But of course, that's just my interpretation, and I'm pretty sure that there are some details that I looked over very, very consciously, because I thought, like, I'm not going to say anything about that because I can't. I just can't. It's too complex. When, for example, in the psychosis paper, Lacan refers to Locke and to Malebranche and to their madness, I was a bit stuck. So the trick is, of course, then to write a sentence that helps you avoid that trap. But I hope that some people will like focus on the little thing that I neglected, and that in that context, yeah, that there will be like discussion and disagreements, and thus an advancement of the studies actually of such conceptual texts.
You know what it also makes me think about? I mean, unfortunately, sometimes in Lacanian circles, we tend to be better read in terms of Lacanian psychoanalysis than other forms of psychoanalysis. So for me, at least, I'm kind of guilty as charged. But I wonder, are there other periods or texts or that have the same literary condensation density of a Lacanian text? So, you know, I was struggling along with in Function and Field, and having a similar issue, I think, to what Stijn's alluding to. Like, you actually cannot really do a full explication of these texts unless you're going to write, you know, in some instances, more than one book on a given text. And so I suppose my question for Lacanians is, how do you account for that particularity of the Lacanian text that's so massively condensed? Some more so than others, but you find that if you try to find, you follow up some of the conceptual coordinates of something he's saying, who the person in dialogue, the implicit silent partner that's being critiqued, sometimes is not so silent, the literary reference, it's so incredibly dense that it's almost like, you know, you sometimes get an image, or I do, that Lacan's got this long text, and then he squeezes it out and gives you this compacted, very, very dense thing. So yeah, I suppose that's my question. Why is that such a function of the Lacanian text? Do we see it elsewhere in psychoanalysis, and what are we to do with that? And maybe just to follow on is also what would be an interesting psychoanalytic exercise is to go back to all the authors and say, well, what's the bit that you felt you had to leave out? Because there's kind of the symptomatic like elision of each of the chapters. Presumably there's something we kind of started as authors trying to say something about, and then realized, I'm not sure I understand this, or I have to leave it out. So it'd be interesting to get a sense of all the bits that were, you know, the kind of virtually repressed elements of the commentaries that weren't further developed.
I can ask them when I interview them.
Yeah.
That would be fun.
Why don't you ask?
Yeah. Just following on Derek's, it's a question that you asked, Derek, but I think that the answer is double. Like, on the one hand, that there are, I guess, psychoanalysts from other traditions, like take Wilfred Bion. He too wrote kind of complex texts and books that also, I guess, lend themselves to detailed commentaries. But at the same time, I think Lacan must be situated within that French tradition where you have this tendency to like both the seminar format and the writing in kind of a complex way. Like, look at Derrida, for example, who is a bit younger than Lacan, but there too you could say that, well, that that could be work done on each of his books and texts as well. Maybe not as much as on Lacan's, but then again, it's a certain way of writing and a certain like intellectual climate. I think that was then very vibrant, and yeah.
Maybe I've got a question then for you guys. What is the relationship between the type of textuality or the type of discourse or the type of symbolization that happens in the seminars as opposed to what happens in the Écrits? Because like a first guess at that would seem to suggest that the one is more worked over, is a function of writing, is polished, condensed, whereas, you know, clearly the seminars are at some level spoken, maybe more spontaneous. But maybe that's an inaccurate characterization. But I wondered if you had any thoughts about that. How would you do that characterization? What's the difference between the type of writing we see in the transcribed seminars, which of course maybe isn't a form of writing at all, it's transcribed speech, you could say, versus the more clearly written quality of the Écrits?
Well, we would actually need Lacan's notes, because he didn't make written notes that's been described in, in biographies of Lacan, that he made these during the weekends. So they must be out there. So it could be very interesting in the future to study the differences between the seminar, the transcription of the seminar, and Lacan's notes, to see whether it's just these notes are just some thoughts, or is it already like more written outlines of reasoning. So I would be very curious about that. But what we do have for some of Lacan's texts, of course, is the handwritten version of it. And that's also kind of interesting, because he was still in the days where people wrote with pen and paper their papers, not with some text processor. He also didn't type them out. And when we see the original texts, well, there's quite some words that Lacan like deletes or changes a little bit, presuming that in the end he has his final version. So I do think these were worked over by him, and that probably also the published ones are not just him, like just in one move, in one take, writing it out, but also like elaborating it. Although the way people were elaborating text in those days is very difficult to imagine now, because with these text processes that we use, it's so easy to switch from introduction to the corpus of a text, and then to the conclusion, and to change your introduction starting from your conclusion. And that must have been so much more difficult in those days.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to talk too much, so I also want to hear Calum's thought on it, but it, it reminds me of the palimpsest, if that's the right way, palimpsetic quality of Freud. So by the time you read the standard edition, you've got, sometimes there's been multiple editions of a text with further, elaboration of footnotes. And you sometimes get a sense of like the footnotes might overtake the text itself. So this kind of odd echo or overwriting, I mean, it exists in some ways in Lacan, I suppose, because, whether it's Seminar on the Purloined Letter, you've got an Écrits version, you've got bits that happen in the seminars. But maybe there's something in the history of writing psychoanalysis where that palimpsest, if I'm saying it right, the accretion, the more notes, more overwriting, or differences in how material is portrayed and written and edited. It just seems like an interesting question, an interesting comparative thought. Calum, what do you think about all that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what you're saying. I mean, approaching it from a more readerly perspective rather than a writerly perspective, to me, the experience of reading the seminars is vastly different from the experience of reading the Écrits, where the seminars seem to, they flow and they don't always make sense. It's, you get that real flavor of someone constructing their ideas as they go along in the seminars, whereas in the Écrits, it is much more of that looping back, and you can feel the retroactivity in the Écrits as one idea folds back on another idea, or a single sentence contains 4 or 5 different lines of thought. It's there's, as you say, there's a density in the Écrits which I don't think is often there in the seminars. It's there in bits of the seminars, but they're also there. I find, and this might be my ignorance, but I find reading the seminars, sometimes there's whole passages where I get the sense Lacan's trying to remember what he's trying to say. It's, he's playing for time because he's in front of a live audience. So he's keeping the discourse moving, and it's that free association. So it's not to say that those moments don't make sense, but they require a sense to be made of them. Whereas the Écrits, there's a density there that you feel in reading it, that every sentence has been crafted, that it's been shaped for a particular set of purposes. And I think that's the thing. It's rarely a single point he's making. He's making multiple points. There's layers, and I think that's one of the gifts of the collections that we've produced, is that we help people unravel or tease out those different strands of thoughts. It's not linear.
Do you guys ever get the sensation, this, and I'm going to misremember the quote, like this idea that James Joyce says at some point, I write, and then hopefully, scholars for the next 100 years will puzzle over what I'm doing. I always, whenever I hear that, I just think that pertains as much, if not more so, to Lacan than James Joyce. And I suppose I'll stop with that. Just, I mean, for me, what's worth remarking on is the sheer kind of inexhaustibility of the texts. So much so that, you know, even some of the texts that we may think we have known or that have had good translations or commentaries, invariably, if you had to go back there, you will find something again. So there's something curious about that to me and sustaining. And maybe that's makes a Lacanian point about the kind of infinite nature of desire or something, that there's the inexhaustibility of the texts. But that, I think, was an experience, if I may speak for us as co-editors as a whole, that really pertains to both trying to write something on those and also to the editorial work. It just feels like it's a somehow inexhaustible project. And I'm not sure it's one we'll be able to give up on or let go of.
It's inexhaustible, but also it pulls you into it. And I think, again, that's a very Lacanian move, that he isn't simply writing down his ideas and saying, here you are, here are my ideas. He's presenting texts which force you as the reader to become a partner in the construction of those ideas. And I think we've been very Lacanian in the project, in the sense that we are engaging with that and saying, okay, we're going to engage with Lacan and construct the ideas. But again, like Lacan himself, we're not doing it in a definitive way. We're leaving that opening for other people to then engage with our texts, so the texts that our contributors have produced, and continue the thinking.
Yeah, I also think what was important to how we set up the project is that we didn't look for coherence at the content level, just at the formal level, like that people had to write a certain type of introduction and then stick to really like paragraph by paragraph and have a conclusion. But we never kind of guided them in how they should read the text, or if that they should use the text of another author and make cross references. And I think that was kind of important, because Lacan is always shifting. That's also what we mentioned with the seminars. He was always shifting. He was never at a place that you thought he would be, just like his definition of the subject. And that was also very clear for me. And you know, for some of the seminars around the 1960s, Lacan has written these so-called comptes rendus, meaning like those summaries of a certain seminar. But when you start reading these, even if you've read the seminar, you're just perplexed, because I'm really worried when I read the compte rendu, but because of the fact that, oh, I missed it. I missed the point. But the fact, of course, is that Lacan wrote these compte rendus like maybe 2 months later, after stopping the seminar, and had been thinking about it and made up his mind in a certain direction, just like we as a reader make up our mind in a certain direction, which just means that he was not a didactical person. He was not like having a specific message that he wanted to communicate. It was shifting for him as well. And that also makes him maybe a difficult author at an academic level, because academics often like when people's ideas can be summarized very clearly, like, okay, this is the Lacanian idea about the subject, or this is Lacan's position about science or psychology. It's not that easy, because it shifts, and it's difficult to kind of not forget that and to pay tribute to it in a certain sense in such a book project was, I think, important.
It's a nice insight, actually, in something about the nature of the subject is reflected in how Lacan describes himself, because he's not where you expect him to be, which is also, I suppose, in some respects, the transferential position of the analyst. Well, depending on how you work. But, you know, there's always this like hope that you do find some consistency or some reiteration, so you can go, aha, I got it right. And of course, he seems to often go out of his way not to do that. I mean, one of the clear examples of that is, it's just because it's fresh in my memory of the On My Antecedents commentary that several of us contributed to. You know, he seems to be going out of his way to say, you think that I'm like in the era of Saussure and structuralism and Levi-Strauss, and you know, there's one or two things there, but he gives you kind of an alternative genealogy for all the bits and pieces of his work, surrealism, for example, that you may have forgotten. So he does seem to play that game. I do have a question though. Sometimes I think in the collections we have suggested that, like or certainly I have, that some of the texts are kind of meta texts, in that once you've paid enough attention to someone on the Purloined Letter, he's giving you clues on how to read the Écrits itself. And this idea that maybe the text contains a kind of Easter egg or something, or the keys to the labyrinth, you know, these kind of analogies. Do you think those are overplayed? Do you think that's the case? I mean, that sounds very clever, but it's kind of satisfying thing to say, but I don't know, maybe it's not true. What do you think?
I think there is an element of that in the Purloined Letter and the overture, that, you know, they're Écrits which were written much later, so they're written with the idea of the collection, the Écrits, in mind. So I think there is definitely that sense of, I'm giving you I'm looking back over my work and I'm making selections, so I'm giving you a framework, but there's also a playfulness in there as well, that here's a framework, but it's not necessarily the framework. And I think in some ways it's, you know, our intention of, or the eventuality of publishing the volumes in reverse order was entirely accidental, but in a sense it works as well, because Lacan's almost doing the same thing himself by setting up, you know, the first of the Écrits in the publication are the ones which look back over the rest of the Écrits. So it kind of works nicely, albeit serendipitously, that we ended up doing the same thing ourselves.
How did that happen?
There was no master plan. It was pure accident. We should have really got together before this recording and constructed a good story about that.
No, but it's better to life. That's how life happens sometimes.
It was good. One volume was ready to go, and it happened to be the ones at the end of the Écrits that was ready to go. The whole project has been beset by let's say behind the scenes adventures. I mean, births, deaths, marriages, and numerous dropouts, people spitting dummies and saying, this is not how you should deal with Lacan. I should never have signed up to this project, and stomping away from it. So there's been drama there, but yeah, it all had a happy ending.
Yeah, and it's a huge project. I feel like I love reading the seminars, but the Écrits, it's more difficult. So it's wonderful to have these volumes. And the seminars, I feel like, yeah, like it gives you the flavor of what analysis is like Lacan's discovering what he's saying as he goes along in some ways. Whereas the Écrits feels like he's taken like ideas from seminars and like edited them down so condensed that it's like several ideas, yeah, in each sentence. And I remember I was in a study group with David Lichtenstein for like 5 years. I think it took us like 1.5 years or something to read like one paper, you know. It's just like, because we would go over every line. What do you think he means here? What's he referencing here? So yeah, if we had these, yeah, that would have been very helpful. So I'm very happy for study groups from now and in the future.
But still, it's kind of interesting to then relate it to the idea of the Purloined Letter, because we tend to be those detectives also in the way we set up the project is like, we are the detectives looking at every corner of the house where there is something, every cupboard, like every paragraph is a cupboard, and each one should be checked. And then the question, of course, is where is the letter? Where is the letter that was hidden? And probably it's just in front of us on the table. And that could be also an interesting question, like, okay, what is the obvious that speaks through the different texts? Because there is something obvious also in Lacan, like the idea of this, his ideas about desire, that psychoanalysis is about, in neurosis, is about the question of desire seems like one of those letters that is just plain in the open, and his idea on the unconscious as something that speaks and that has nothing to do with conscious thought. So this is also, like, you could say, like out in the open, and these are like fairly easy points to get, although of course to work with them and to understand the broad implication of it, you do need like the context, just like the letter in the purloined letter. Just with that letter, when you don't know the context, you can't do anything with it. So it is because it has a certain significance, and yeah. So that's maybe also an interesting way to check the texts, actually, and our work, and the authors, of course, the job that we've been doing on these texts.
So what did each of you write about?
Can't remember.
Repressed.
Yeah.
I think Calum must remember, because you have your key text in the last volume. Eh?
Well, yes. Well,
You don't have to go through it now, but I will have you back to talk about each of your chapters.
Okay.
yeah. Well, we've all got bits in the final volume, so it kind of represents us nicely. But yeah, I mean, I wrote a piece on the mirror stage for the final volume, and collaborated on the piece on aggressivity in the final volume. Which is, I guess that's the other thing about the project, is we are, we've edited this and kind of overseen it, but we've also been authors in it, and that in itself is a fascinating process. That's and in some ways, I think I see in some ways the whole set of volumes as an invitation to other people to do the same thing. And as we've been saying, these are not meant to be definitive texts. And I mean, Stijn, I really like your idea of what is the letter here? What's the obvious sitting on the fireplace, on the mantelpiece? And one of the obvious points in the Écrits for me is that everything needs to be interpreted. And what we've done is we've provided an interpretation, but it's not the interpretation. And our texts in turn need to be interpreted. So it really is an invitation to engage with Lacan. It's not trying to do the work of reading for you. And I think it does paradoxically do some of the work of reading for you. And that's the danger in our text, is that they lure people into thinking, okay, you buy these 4 colorful volumes and you don't need to ever touch the Écrits. But actually, that's not the case. And hopefully the contributions invite you to go to the Écrits rather than excuse you from having to touch the Écrits, and engage you in that process of interpretation. Because I've enjoyed editing this. I've enjoyed working with Stijn and Derek, and enjoyed working with all the contributors. But I've also really enjoyed just sitting down in a quiet room with Lacan and giving myself that luxury to slowly read Lacan and slowly try and puzzle over it. And yeah, it's not always pleasurable. It's a kind of jouissance. It's pleasure, it's pain, it's, there's moments of frustration, there's moments when we have to get in touch with each other, phone Danny Nobus and say, what the hell is going on in this sentence? And, it's a journey, it's an adventure, which is really exciting in itself. And we don't want to deprive anyone else of that journey, but hopefully we've given people a little bit of help to make that journey. And we've done some of the obvious work as well. I mean, there are references in there that, yes, they require interpretation, but there's kind of that rather banal legwork you need to do just to figure out what was Lacan referring to. And I think we've done a lot of that work for people, which maybe allows them to go to the juicier stuff slightly quicker.
Yeah, I always hope that people go to the original source. Like, hopefully they'll read the paper in the Écrits and like see what they get out of it, and then look at the book and see what you've gotten out of it, you know, because it also, so with everything people should do that, because so many times like so many different people reference, you know, a certain text, say of Freud or Lacan, and then, you know, everyone has this interpretation, or some big person wrote an interpretation and everyone just references that, and then when you go back and read the actual text, you're like, I don't really see it that way. You know what I mean? So like, it's always important to go back and see what you think the person's saying, you know?
Yeah, and I imagine people will do that, and that's great, because, you know, none of these texts are meant to be definitive. You know, and you see there's contradictions within the contributions to a volume as well, that people have interpreted things in different ways, and possibly even the same author has interpreted things in different ways, because it is all open to interpretation. And one of the things I really like about the four volumes is the voices that shine through, because this could have been so flat, you know, it's all commenting on Lacan, and we could have imposed a certain stipulations on how people worked that that squashed things. But actually, when you read it, although they're all commentaries on particular Écrits, they're all commentaries on Lacan, you really hear the voices of the contributors as well, which again is a really lovely part of it. It's not just Lacan.
Well, and that's the great thing too about Lacanians, is that everyone's so different. Like Lacanian psychoanalysis allows for so many different ways of being that, yeah, I don't feel like people are like, when I was in an institute, for example, I felt like everyone was like, this is how you're supposed to be, this is how you're supposed to think. And this allows you to ask questions and open questions rather than like giving you the interpretation that you're supposed to be making, you know?
Yeah, I don't think we know the interpretation that you're supposed to be making, which maybe makes that easier. It's about opening that call up.
Mm.
I have a question for my co-editors. Do you have a favorite Écrit?
You mean prior to reading our own commentary volumes, or?
Yeah, so a favorite Écrit rather than a favorite commentary.
Yeah. Well, I think I wrote my commentary on my favorite Écrit, which was the text on psychosis. So on a question prior to any possible treatment of psychosis. Yeah. That's my favorite, and of course I had the luxury of being one of the three that could make a first choice. So you guys know that I was quite quick to say that I wanted that one.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's of course the reason why, because for me it's not just a paper about psychosis, it's also like in the middle part of that Écrit, he gives like an excellent summary, just of his psychoanalytic theory and about identification, and yeah. So for me that's kind of the one that has been fascinating me for a long time actually. But at the same time, there's other ones, like I'm also very interested in Signs and Truth, for example. I also think that that's a very interesting paper, because there, well, the whole question of psychoanalysis versus science. I'm working, of course, in a school of psychology, and people want to be very scientific over there. So teaching psychoanalysis and also trying to safeguard something that is so crucial in psychoanalysis that cannot be reduced to the scientific model is also a very important question for me. So that's also a paper that attracted me. But looking earlier in the volumes, for me also the mirror stage is like, it's such a foundational text, because yeah, many of the ideas in the later Lacan are still echoes of the mirror stage text. It's many of the theses in the mirror stage text have never been contradicted by Lacan himself. So that's also for me like a very important paper for anybody studying Lacan should actually very early on tackle the mirror stage paper. So these are just three. It's difficult to choose between one of them, but yeah.
What about you, Calum?
Yeah, I mean, I chose initially to do the mirror stage, partly because it was the first Lacan that I read myself. I came to Lacan through doing a master's, and one of the set texts was the mirror stage. And I think it's probably one of those texts that is set on, if you're going to do a bit of Lacan on a course which is not about Lacan, then the mirror stage is the go-to text because it's well known, it's short, and so I knew it well, and I think I came to love it more the more I worked on it. But also, working on the other ones. But one of the ones that really struck me was the overture, which working on that is such a lovely little text, and so rich and so profound in the context of the Écrits that it's saying something. It's a little bit like a hologram, it's a tiny bit of Lacan or tiny bit of the Écrits that kind of contains the bigger picture within itself without itself being a summary, which I think beyond the content of the overture, it strikes me as such a masterful piece of writing. So yeah, that would be one of my favorites. But even the aggressivity chapter, which I worked on, and I didn't initially set out to work on that one, and ended up working on it, and that in itself was quite a nice journey to be working on a commentary you hadn't, as Stijn says, we had the luxury of choosing our commentaries, but then coming back and working on something that I hadn't chosen, that ended up being a different relationship with the text. And yeah, I've become very fond of it in the process. I mean, some of the other ones I had very little to do with, like Science and Truth and Kant and Sade, is, again, text which I've worked over in other contexts. Logical Time is a text that I would have chosen, but I knew that Dominique would do a much better job of it than I could ever do, so I had to kind of give that one up. But it's a wonderful text, and he did do a wonderful job of it, much better one than I could ever have done. So it's a win-win.
Yeah, there's some, I mean, this also sort of fascinates me outside of this project, but the question of which are the writing projects or the papers you started, but for whatever reason were unable to finish. So I initially had started something, doing a commentary on Instance of the Letter, which I find really, fascinating, partly just because of the instance, agency of the letter, the various, ramifications of different ways of translating that the title of that Écrit. So somewhere I've got like quite detailed notes, but it kind of crashed and burned, and there were things happening, and I just couldn't finish it. And then Calum Matheson did a really nice job on it. So it's kind of curious which of the ones we started. But for me, some of one of the most intimidating and difficult is Subversion of the Subjects. And Fabio Vigi's done a great service to Lacanian readers. And I go back to that from time to time. And of course, I mean, for all of us, there'll be different texts that are more foreboding or difficult or challenging in different ways, which relates to another nice psychoanalytic theme. Which facet of psychoanalytic theory eludes you despite your attempts to get to grips with it? So agency is one. Instance is one I really love. Also, function and field is just so foundational, given that it does seem to be, Lacan's idea, certainly Jacques-Alain Millet's characterization that this is now, bang, where teaching officially begins, and its proximity to the actual beginning of the seminar, and seminar one. So that's another one. But yeah, Subversion is one that scares me. I don't think I've got my my head around that yet. But also Kant with Sade is a great later text. But it's funny which are the ones we forget, you know, because looking at the contents, Jean-Michel Rabatet did a Youth of Guide, and I don't often hear that one cited. So I'm kind of curious as to which are the neglected écrits within the collection.
Yeah, I mean, Confession Time, the paper on criminology, I had never read until we undertook this project. You know, I read the Écrits, but the rare Écrits I just skipped over because I thought, I'm not really that interested in criminology. It's quite a long text. Didn't really seem that engaging. Read the first few pages, dropped it. But actually being forced as an editor to engage with the text and with the commentary on the text, it's a brilliant text. So there are real gems in there that are neglected. And again, I hope that we've opened some of those gems up by not being selective ourselves and saying we're going to do the whole thing, not the best of the Écrits, but the whole Écrit. I'm kind of hoping we have shone a light onto those darker corners too.
Yeah, definitely.
And how was it like for On My Antecedents, where there were so many people contributing? How was that to write?
I think I got a little overexcited in doing that, which is a sort of characteristic trait of mine. But I mean, partly the idea there was, I started some work on it. But then when I was speaking to colleagues, well, one of the first things that happened is one of the big topics there is mental automatism. And I needed to get a lot more information. And so I started reading and doing the research. And lo and behold, Stijn had written a really nice article on really informative, instructive, reference piece on mental automatism. So I ended up reading that and incorporating quite a lot of it. And saying, I'm citing you all the time here, Stijn. Don't you think we could kind of do this one together? So that was one of the first steps there. But then I just Sinan Richards
you didn't want me to accuse you of plagiarism.
Exactly. That's the, that's the less diplomatic way of putting it. But exactly, yeah. And then Sinan is in French studies, and of course I don't speak French, so he could help a lot. And both John Delalio and Benjamin Strasberg also helped look for stuff. And I kind of wonder, I don't know whether it's a good working model to continue, because there's something nice about being the sole author and fully responsible for what you're doing. But I kind of wonder, actually, in some ideal world, whether it's almost like you could have something like the structure of a cartel to write a commentary, because presumably, Lacan's a kind of polymath, and constantly seems to be doing 3 or 4 different conceptual tasks at the same time, and that's another great theme within Lacanian theory that became prominent in the project. What kind of figuration or mode of conveying or mode of transmission or is he using language and metaphor? Is he using diagrams? Is he using mathemes? And of course, in many instances, it's kind of all of the above. But back to the initial point, I think it's kind of a nice idea if you've got a team of experts, someone who's got, say, French literary history and French studies down, someone who has got more of a good a perspective on the history of psychiatry, someone else who's got something on social theory. Sometimes it works like that. But I suppose maybe sometimes it could pose problems of articulation. But maybe to pose a question to all of us is, ages ago now, this idea was posed that, like, okay, Freud needs to use mythology to convey certain kinds of ideas. And Lacan plays with various ways of doing that. But I wonder, in the experience of working on this commentary volume, what are the ways that, I don't want to say meta-theoretical, but what are the modalities of conveying psychoanalysis that we see represented? And of course, we could think about, mathemes. Well, he doesn't use myths in quite the same way that Freud does. But sometimes it's reference to literature. Sometimes it is reference to other modes of inscription, mathematical ideas. Anyways, yeah, so just an open-ended question. Did that occur to anyone? And what do you think comes through in the Écrits in terms of those different modes of conveying psychoanalysis or formalizing? That's what I'm trying to get at, formalizing and conveying the ideas.
Well, what I think is, well, what we see here is that he adopts different discourses, like say, like Freud did, adopted mythical accounts. Lacan adopts different discourses, like the linguistic discourse with the signifier and the signified. Maybe that's also a way of trying to talk about the unconscious, just like Freud needed, for example, the myth of Oedipus to kind of explain something, and then Lacan is indeed leaving that aside, but he has a different discourse that he uses, and I think it's linguistics, and it's Claude Lévi-Strauss's structuralism, but he always leaves these aside, and indeed switches to other discourses, like the mathematical or the logical discourse, and but maybe it's just like Freud, what was in the end also not sticking to one myth, and also using artists in a different way, like Leonardo da Vinci, for example. The way Freud uses Leonardo is unimaginable, starting from Lacan. But just like I think Lacan's use of the saussure is unimaginable from a Freudian perspective. But I would rather say that it's in Lacan's discursive choices and how he switches there, that he walks a certain trajectory in the end, just like Freud did, but the themes remain something of the same, like the unconscious, the question of the subject, jouissance, the question of the real, the symbolic, and the imaginary. That kind of remains the same, especially through these Écrits that we've been commenting upon in these volumes. Yeah, that would be my answer here.
I mean, there's a lot of it, right? I mean, there's the graph of desire, there's the schemas, there's that famous L schema. At the end of the Purloined Letter, there's that intricate mathematical series of formulations with the, the kind of complex 0, 1, 1, that with reference to the I nearly said coin tossing game, coin tossing.
Yeah.
We can analyze that later. There's in Function and Field, Mark de Kessel was I think very apt in noting the role of reference to the I Ching. I don't know if you'll be able to see it, and we got this kind of diagram. I suppose what I'm starting to think about, like when we were preparing the text, what were the diagrams? What were the figures? What were the different modes of depiction that were required? And that's really important to Lacan. I mean, it's all the way through, and there's something particular about how he's choosing to convey ideas. The other one, of course, is the optical schema. I think Ed Plough, is it on maybe in the second volume, when we've got the more complex optical schema. I can have a look at it. But yeah, it's interesting when he needs to introduce those and to what purpose.
Yeah, that's in the Blue Book. And the commentary on Daniel Lagache.
There we go. Here we go. Yeah.
As Stijn says, it's that movement through and kind of flexibility of engaging with different discourses. That, you have that use of schema, that move towards a more algebraic presentation of ideas and kind of pushing away from the imaginary. But it's also through the Écrits, drawing on literature, and you referenced earlier the Écrits on Gide, but even in the mirror stage, towards the end of the mirror stage, there's that series of reference to existential literatures. And the mirror stage itself is kind of almost a microcosm of that, and it begins with references to Sartre, ends with references to Hegel. So you've got that kind of philosophical framework, but you've also got that movement through biology and zoology, psychology, literature, and so you've got this kind of touching off and bouncing off various different discourses without ever being subsumed into those discourses.
Interestingly, though, Freud is also one language through which Lacan can do Lacan, right? Because, I mean, the way of approaching it is, well, he's commenting on building upon, expanding upon Freudian psychoanalysis. But if you think of the numerous times that we go back to the Fort Dar game and what Lacan does with it, it's interesting that Freud can also be a language for distinctively Lacanian concepts. The other one, of course, is the reference to topology. And what I always found, amazing, just in terms of when we're supposedly told at some point, it's important to periodize, and when Lacan's writing this, and it's, it's significant because they change the concept so often. But what's always so kind of striking is that all the way back at the time of function and field, which, as I'd said already, we're talking the 50s, right towards the beginning of the seminar one, there's a topological reference to and a formulation of death drive in via the torus, which you can well see anticipating much later developments when topology becomes a much more prominent mode of conveying ideas. Knots is, of course, another one, although that doesn't really appear so much in at all, I don't think, in the Écrits.
You asked earlier, Derek, what's the conceptual bit of Lacan that still evades us? I think for me, it's topology. I'm constantly falling through the hole in the middle of a torus, trying to get my head around topology.
Yeah.
Do you do that with students, though? Because sometimes people get hung up on, like, I need to understand what all the dots and arrows and everything means in the L schema. The graph of sexuation. This is another big one. Like, okay, now we've got to fully figure out what's going on and be able to illustrate everything with this. And it's interesting what peers say about it. Sometimes people say, well, it's there. If it works for you, it works for you. And I suppose I kind of do that. Like, if it is helpful for you, then, use it. But I don't know if you need to necessarily base everything on that. And I just wanted to note also that Paul Verhaag was the person where I got that idea from. Well, he gets it from Lacan as well. That myth is a means of formalization for Freud, and Lacan is clearly trying to avoid some of the imaginary trappings of that, and hence there's this constant push to find different ways of formulating the ideas. But what also, if I remember correctly, Paul Verhaag goes on to say that, and here's a question for us, is it the case that when we get to topological formalization or formulation, that when we get to certain mathematical modes of formulation, this is not metaphoric, this is not merely illustrative, this is the thing, which I kind of love, but it sort of, it kind of is hard to believe at some level. But anyways, just throwing that out there.
Yeah, that's of course, that's a difficult question, because what is a metaphor in Lacan? So it's clearly not the Lacanian metaphor, the model, that's for sure. But at the same time, it's like, it's not mathematics. Lacan's topology is, well, it's based on mathematics, and like I did some work on knot theory, or Lacan's knot theory, and many things of what he says are correct, but he also says stupidities about knot theory, mathematically speaking. And then his idea then is that, of course, that the three rings represent the imaginary, symbolic, and the real, and that the way they are relating the registers in a knot, or these are the ways these registers relate to one another, and it's not metaphorical, it's literal. Yeah, it's kind of difficult to take it all too literally.
But isn't it a nice case of the sort of ebb and flow of, because we were talking about the different discursive styles, like how you would compare seminar to Écrits, for example. But another way of thinking about that is the movement between the almost severe sort of ultra symbolic formulations or formalizations of topology. There's the torus, there's the torus. And the endless sort of complexities, depth, the exhaustibility of the descriptions in Écrits. You know what I'm saying? So you get this, on the one hand, a move to de-imaginarized, pure symbolic mathemes of sorts, or at least an experiment in doing that, which seems to shear away a lot of the imaginary stuff. But then you've got texts which have got this kind of mega layering of literary, philosophical resonances and cadences. So it's kind of almost like you got a counterbalance between two very different modes of doing a similar kind of work. I mean, I'm guessing.
Yeah. And then again, we still have to make the link with the clinic, because of course, these texts and all these lines of reasonings and these schemas only make sense in the question of doing psychoanalysis. And I think it's their usefulness in conceptualizing clinical work is the ultimate touchstone. Where also and that's not something we did with the project, of course, but how do these texts orient us in advancing clinical work and in relieving people from severe suffering in how they find a way and how maybe the actions of an analyst helped them. And then the question is, of course, like, is a text, is a certain conceptual line of reasoning, is a specific schema, is it helpful to understand what we were doing? Because especially, when we work with the unconscious, it's not that all the actions of the analyst are programmed. It's not that. So we need the tools, but that's for me also like ultimately what it is about. And it's not just like, is Lacan's topological representation, for example, of the real, the symbolic, and the imaginary, is that the ultimate representation? Is that better than the descriptions that we see like in the Écrits? Well, let's clinically see what it brings us to think of the real or the symbolic in these different ways. And there, for me, there's still work to be done. It's not just that Lacan progressed and ultimately he obtained wisdom. It's more that no, he shifted, and when he would have lived until he was 100, he would still have shifted. It wouldn't have stopped. So yeah, the clinical, I think, is also very important and not taken into account by us here in these volumes.
Is there a sense, Stijn, that our volumes are being used by clinicians to advance their practice? Because in one sense, we're all academics, and there is a certain academic tone to the 4 volumes that we've put together. But are you aware that clinicians are also using these texts to think about the ideas to inform on their practice?
Well, I can just speak about the text on psychosis. There, it is used because, clinically speaking, people are being confronted with psychosis, and then you need conceptual tools. And then you turn to Lacan, and then you don't understand very much about what he's saying there. And then people start reading the text, and hopefully it helps them. Just like, for example, we teach the text on the mirror stage in our postgraduate training program. That's a 1 day just on the text on the mirror stage, and of course students can also turn they're pointed to the commentary volumes, and based on that text we can indicate quite clearly what we should not do as a psychoanalyst, how we don't work with the ego. And then I do believe that the more contextual understanding also of the philosophical implications, and also the many references that Lacan makes and how it is clarified in a text like yours is really helpful for young clinicians to not be blown away also by certain texts, and to dive really directly into the question as to how it orients clinical work.
Yeah, I've had some thoughts on that. I mean, on the one hand, for me, something like the L schema, if you read it's the L schema in conjunction with the mirror stage, it kind of, I mean, so don't misquote me on it because it sounds weird coming out like this, but it's a kind of mapping of how to locate oneself in a clinical treatment as an analyst, right? So if precisely in the way I think that Stijn was already alluding to, you don't want to situate the self as an analyst as the alter ego to the ego of the analysand. So in some respects, every now and again, it seems kind of clear how some of what's being described and portrayed does have direct clinical bearings. In other instances, less so. And I think maybe that's where that work can't be simply codified, right? It's not like you can have a therapy manual on the basis of the Écrits, but it's kind of a productive area, and it maybe is most productive that it remains unarticulated, like how to utilize or used in a teaching environment where clinicians will experiment with those ideas. So I kind of like that tension. I mean, I know that, certainly, in fact, Calum, your mirror stage text is something I use in undergrad teaching all the time, once a year at least. So, it's, then again, not all of those students are going to be clinicians. But the other thought that came to my mind about all of this is, and sometimes it's a tension or a struggle, even when one is in a cartel or doing reading groups at the seminars, particularly in the early seminars, but really all the way, Lacan is constantly reading, is a reader of psychoanalysis. And I often feel that just because it's so much difficulty and so time consuming to struggle with a seminar, that we often don't spend enough time reading the texts that he's commenting on. So as Lacanians, we're pretty good at reading Lacan, hopefully, and we're pretty good at reading Freud, but we're not always that great in reading the multiple different texts that he is commenting on, often quite, with a certain degree of force, you could say. It's almost like we're told, well, don't read ego psychology, it's all BS compared to what Lacan does. But I can imagine, and let's not start another editorial project just yet, please, but it would be quite nice to have something like the reader for Seminar 1, which is all the stuff, or a large part of the stuff, that Lacan is responding to. I'm thinking about Ella Sharp, for example. Is it Seminar 4 when he's doing, no, it's not Seminar 4, maybe it's Seminar 5, when he's quite a sustained engagement with her theory and her examples, clinical examples of dream interpretation. So sometimes I get that feeling, and I think it's also a tension in preparing volumes like this. How do you do justice to all of that material that he is responding to? I mean, you could have like a series of infinitely expanding footnotes trying to also contextualize that material. So don't know really where I'm going with all of that. It's just that there's a lot of other material, some of which is actually very fundamentally clinical, that he's engaged with in the production of his arguments. And also interesting, sometimes the so-called silent interlocutors or the silent partners that don't get named, that sometimes he's quite condemning of. Maybe some future project will bring some of those silent interlocutors to life again, but just a thought.
Yeah, but it is kind of encyclopedic as well. I mean, there's the clinical references, but also the philosophical references, as I said earlier, the biological references, the literary references, and who is going to be abreast of all that stuff? It's it's so much to take in, and as you say, some of those references, thinking more of the seminars than the Écrits, but some of the references are touched upon. There's a paragraph, and then when you actually start to dig into that, you actually need to know the entirety of the work that's being referenced before you can really understand the full force of the point that Lacan's trying to make, and that work then becomes ever expansive. So yeah, maybe another editorial project after all.
Well, I think it's more like building a library that we then need to do, not just like commentary volumes, but it would be very fascinating to kind of bring together, like also physically or online, of course, like all those references where, for example, when Sharp is mentioned, that we can immediately go to the text or the text by Sharp that Lacan has been commenting upon, but also like the novels. And yeah, so to have these really more in an accessible format, because I do agree with Derek that often when reading Lacan is already so complex, that it's very discouraging also to when you still have to go to yet another source.
Yeah.
And not just a commentary source on Lacan or previous work by Lacan, but one that he's commenting upon, because then you kind of trust, okay, but Lacan was so clever, he will have taken the gist from the text. But of course, when you start like reading the text themselves, you see that he's always selective. And that's always then the question, what does he take and why and how is he kind of like giving a twist to it, sometimes in a very clever way. but sometimes also to just do service to his own ideas that he was developing, and not so much to doing service to the author that he was referring to. And therefore, it would be very good to start composing such a library, maybe.
You could have like a Wikipedia, but for Lacan seminars where different people can edit and like add to like different points, and then other people can like the community can check and say whether they agree with that addition or reference or not.
You see what happens when you get a bunch of obsessionals working on an editorial project. Now we got to have it all. We need to document and locate and everything. So, which I'm kind of weirdly proud of. But anyway.
But Vanessa, we're still looking for a web editor to do that. So
yeah, be careful what you volunteer to do.
Yeah, well, here's a call out. Who has IT experience and wants to help? A lot of students listen to this podcast, and a lot of them know how to do that stuff.
Maybe one thing just to mention before we wrap up, if indeed we are about to wrap up, is what comes next. And that's the Écrits, sorry, pronunciation problems, project, which in some ways might be even more daunting, but more welcome than what we've already embarked on, just because those texts, although there is the French volume, sorry, I'm looking for, this doesn't exist in a single English volume. So, I mean, one of the things I think we've all been very excited about and nicely surprised about is how quickly people signed up when we suggested the project. Not quite sure why, actually, but maybe it's just because there's a thirst and enthusiasm and an interest in doing it. But, you know, some of the difficulties we experienced with the labyrinthine quality of the Écrits texts are kind of multiplied now, because the texts don't have a uniformity in their translation, because different people have translated them at different times, sometimes in, you know, published forms, sometimes in less than, you know, established forms. And they're even more difficult in many respects. And they vary from, you know, the family complexes thing early on, all the way to incredibly difficult Écrits. So, I mean, I don't know what my colleagues wanted to say about that, but it's both an exciting project, but it's almost as if what we've done now, although that's kind of a nice achievement, is kind of the learning first steps to what might be a much more challenging editorial project, but hopefully an exciting one.
But in some ways, the challenge, as you kind of alluded to, one of the challenges is getting people to buy into the project. And in a sense, the success of the Écrits projects has already done that work for us, because as you suggest, when we suggested doing the Ultra Écrits, people were so enthusiastic. People were like, yeah, it was like the party everyone wants a ticket to. So that's been fantastic. People have been really positive about it, really keen to be involved. So I think I can see it happening in a very urgent way, which is really exciting. But as you say, Derek, it's going to be a very different product, because in the sense that certainly for the English-speaking world, our commentaries were always designed to sit beside Bruce Fink's translation. That was always the idea. But this time, there's no unified translation for the volumes to sit next to, so it will inevitably be a stand-in for the Ultra Écrits in the English-speaking world, which is kind of odd and daunting, but also incredibly liberating.
It's kind of an opportunity, because it could be more polyphonic, if polyphonic means what I think it means.
It will be, of course, because it's so different texts, and they will lead to completely different kinds of commentaries, of course, and also. Well, in the Écrits we still have like Lacan from a specific era in time, and now we will have like very early Lacan to very late Lacan, and so that will be so different perspectives within Lacan, also just next to one another. Yeah.
And you also have a Lacan conference coming up in September, right?
Yeah, that's also something that is coming up. Yeah, the 20th and the 21st of September of this year, 24. We have a conference in Ghent, Lacan Today, where, we already selected the speakers. There will be about 80 papers that will be presented over the 2 days with a couple of keynotes speakers and then in parallel sessions. So yeah, I'm really happy with the huge interest from all over Europe and United States to come over to Ghent and to here the idea is like the living work with that corpus of Lacan, both how philosophers make use of it, people in literature, but also clinicians, students preparing a PhD, experienced clinicians, and that just how people work with it, and to have these people interact with one another to kind of have that dynamic. We already had a couple of Lacan conferences, and that dynamic turns out to be there. That enthusiasm that was also present in our volumes is something, that just academically speaking really makes sense to support and to provide a place for it beyond the grouping of analysts in schools.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for being here.
Well, thank you very much for having us, Vanessa.
All right. And I'll talk to you again probably next year when I start interviewing everyone for their Écrits.
Okay, cool project.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.